My basic motivation for being a libertarian had never been economic but moral. While I was convinced that a free market was more efficient and would bring about a far more prosperous world than statism, my major concern was moral. The insight that coercion and aggression of one man over another was criminal and iniquitous and must be combated and abolished. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we are speaking with the Libertarian presidential candidate, Dr. Joe Jorgensen. Dr. Jorgensen, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me be here.
What is libertarianism?
Well, it's basically live and let live, that we allow people to make their own choices, and in return, we get to make our choices. And we don't give the power to the bureaucrats in Washington.
And why do libertarians criticize government so much instead of companies or social clubs or other organizations?
Well, because companies and social clubs are voluntary. If you don't like what a social club is doing, just don't join it. If you don't like what a corporation is doing, just don't buy from them. Don't pay for their services. And I've seen many people who will say, oh my gosh, I would never go with UPS, only FedEx. I would only go with FedEx, never UPS. But with the government, you have no choice. So right now, Americans don't have a choice in educating their kids because we've got a National Department of Education that is setting the standards for everyone. We don't have a choice in healthcare because government is taking that away with licensing. There are many choices we don't have. So the government basically takes our money and makes our choices for us, and we don't get to choose what we want.
So we have, in principle, people have the right to make choices for themselves. They have a better claim to their life and their time than others. What are some of the utilitarian benefits to freedom? If I really care about the general well-being and prosperity of the masses, why should I care about libertarianism?
Well, let's start with the environment. If you take out a globe and you mark down where all the countries with large government are, and then you put down where the pollution is, you'll see that they match almost perfectly. Wherever there's big government, there's big pollution. Freedom means a cleaner environment. Also, it means utilitarian. Let's bring the troops home. It would save a lot of money and save a lot of lives and make us safer. And I just had an interviewer ask me last week, well, but we make military planes. So a lot of people would be out of a job. And I said, well, that money has to come from somewhere to pay for those planes. So tell you what, tell the taxpayers that instead of spending money on military planes, you get to keep that money and buy plane tickets. So instead of the military making airplanes, allow the people to keep their money, use the airplanes to go on a vacation, and the soldiers' lives are saved. And if you look at what happens around the world, the more we're in other countries, like being in the Middle East, the less safe we are. And the irony there is that the military is supposed to make us more safe, not less safe.
So let's say I am someone who generally sees the wealthy taken care of, but I just genuinely care about the poor. Let's forget about global poverty. Let's just focus on the poor in America. Or I guess this would also apply overseas. Why should I care about libertarianism if I see the state as the mechanism to achieve a better life for the poor?
Because the state doing that does a poor job, just like they do a poor job with everybody else. If you want to help the poor, then you should be able to put your money where you think it would best go. In fact, a question that I've asked is, let's say you have an inheritance. Let's say you are well off and you want to help people. And you've got maybe, you get a $50,000 inheritance. Where are you going to put that $50,000? You may look at your local church. Perhaps they could get it to the needy, or maybe a private charity. And looking at all of the options, would you ever say, you know what, I'm going to take that $50,000 and I'm going to give it to a federal government program? And most people laugh and they say, that's absurd. No, the government can't do a good job.
And is this something realistically achievable? Do we have real world examples of voluntary charity being a significant factor in improving the lives of the impoverished?
Oh, absolutely. We've got, first of all, we can look at this in two different ways. Is there accountability when we give our monies to private charity instead of the government? And yes, I have a great example. In the early 1990s, A famous story came out that the president of United Way spent something like $400,000 on fancy artwork. And by the way, I'd like to remind you that with inflation, that'd be closer to $1 million right now. And donations started drying up. The people were just outraged. They said, hey, we gave you that money to give to the poor, not to buy fancy artwork. So they stopped giving United Way money. So what United Way had to do was basically work their butts off to prove to the people that they were going to put their money in the right places. Now, imagine that same money goes to the government and there's high overhead. There's no accountability. If they don't have enough money, they just simply raise taxes and bring in more money. And you're asking for basically empirical data. I'd like to point out that before government got into the charity business, we had so much charity going on in this country. Even the supposed greedy capitalists were great philanthropists. And when the federal government started the war on poverty, poverty had been going down dramatically. And then as soon as the federal government got involved, it started tapering off a little bit and the descent wasn't as great. So all of the great strides that were being made started slowing down.
So let's take the position on healthcare. Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, very focused on healthcare in America. We have very high prices. It takes up a large portion of your income because healthcare is so expensive. And this is generally pinned on there being a free market in healthcare with little to no government intervention as the result of the high cost. What is the libertarian response to high costs in healthcare?
If I could get one message, one thing to every American in this country, it would be that it is a myth that we have free market healthcare. What I hear AOC and everybody else saying is, look, the free market doesn't work, we have to go to single payer. And I just want to say, no, we haven't had the free market system since at least World War II. And it was after government got involved that the prices started going up. If we could return to a free market, then prices would go down. And yes, I have data for that as well. If you look at the two most free market fields in medicine, and again, they're not entirely free market, but they're more free market, and that would be cosmetic surgery and LASIK surgery. And the reason they're somewhat free market is people have to pay for them themselves. The insurance companies don't pay for it. So what happens? Just as in capitalism, the doctors have to compete for customers. And so they have to offer better quality, lower prices. And if you look at the data, the quality has been going great. It's been going sky high and prices have gone down dramatically. So the two places in which healthcare has been going down are the two places in which we have free market healthcare. And that's what I would like to see in the rest of the fields. I would like to see, for instance, cardiac surgeons. Let them compete for people's dollars. Let them have to outbid. And we can look at a country, Singapore, that's done a great job with that. For example, I mentioned a cardiac surgeon. Heart bypass surgery here in the United States costs $130,000. If you look over in Singapore, where people are in charge of their dollars and doctors have to compete, heart bypass there is $18,000. It's a fraction. I mean, people buy cars with that amount of money. So we talk about people not being able to afford healthcare. You know, people here can't even afford the insurance, let alone the surgeries. If you look at the cost of the actual healthcare, it would be much more in line with the free market.
Correct, yeah. And we have empirical data by Dr. Mary J. Ruwart in her book, Death by Regulation. You also have regulations like you can't compensate someone if they give you a kidney. In Iran, you're allowed to, and they're the one country without a kidney shortage. That kills tens of thousands of Americans every single year. This is the libertarian, utilitarian solution that we have. As far as what is going on now, today is June 6th. We have had about a week and a half of protests, riots, and looting after the events of George Floyd being killed by the officers in Minnesota. What is the libertarian response to police brutality?
Well, first of all, it was the federal government that put that in motion. A lot of people don't realize that when we see local police forces with their tanks and all the military equipment, either they got that equipment from the government or they were given money to buy it, and they probably received free training from the government. Now, again, crime is a local level issue. The police are a local service. If you get robbed, if you get mugged, if you get assaulted, you go to the local police. There's no reason to have a military tank. So if people were given the choice, should we have our property taxes raised so we can buy a military tank? Which would you rather put your money in, a military tank or a better school? Most people would choose a better school, and they wouldn't even buy the military tank. But what the federal government does is it takes our money, buys the tanks and the free training, and then it goes to the citizens or it goes to the police departments, and they say, hey, we've got free equipment, we've got free training, would you like it? And it's hard to turn down free, especially since you've already paid for it. So people are being forced to pay for something they don't have. So the problem is with police being militarized, now that's their response. And so we get a really steep escalation that we wouldn't have if police didn't act like the military. And I'd like to add, just like I don't want to see our military at war around the world, I don't want to see our military at war with our citizens either.
Do you think there's also a psychological component to the citizen-state relationship? In other words, if there's just the assumption the citizen has to do exactly what the officer says, they have the right to make rules that we have to abide by, do you think maybe, as someone with a background in psychology, there is a intellectual approach that we could bring to just the idea of citizen-police interactions that might decrease the likelihood that violence arises?
Well, just looking at it from a general level, if we look at the police, what is their purpose? And if we read the sides of the cop cars, it says to serve and protect, or it says community and whatever. However, in many cases, they're not acting like that. But I would like to say that a lot of this has to do with all of the laws that we have. For instance, drug laws. What we've done is we've put the police in a position in which they're not just simply driving around the neighborhood, getting to know the different people and tipping their hat and saying, nice to meet you. Instead, now we've got them going after people who are not committing a crime at all. And again, that just adds to the us versus them.
Sure. You mentioned on your website, joej2020.com, that you, for the same reason you support free trade among the states in America, you support free trade amongst countries around the world. Why do you support free trade, and why should I, as someone who cares deeply about the American poor, support something like free trade?
Well, I noticed your intro said something about being morally correct. So I would first of all say that absolutely people have the moral right to trade with whomever they want. If they have a product, if they have a service, they have the right to trade with whoever they want for whatever price they want, because that's the moral way. Economically, I would say it makes sense, because if you have greater competition, now we get lower prices. If you can buy a service or a product from 5 different countries, then they're competing, and you get it from the lowest, you get it for the lowest cost, because now you've got different people trying to get your business. And from a third standpoint, I would say peace. You tend to not bomb your best customer. And a quick story here: in the early '80s, I had a Fiat Spider. And I had an older gentleman walk over towards me, and he had kind of a scowl on his face. And he asked me, how could I ever be driving a car from Italy after what they did to us in World War II? Now, I didn't want to get into a debate with him, because, he served our country and, was willing to sacrifice his life. So I wanted to treat him with respect. But if I could have had, an equal debate with him, I would have said, look, I bought this car from Italy. If enough people buy cars from Italy, guess what? Italy's not going to want to bomb us. Japan, again, another former enemy. I don't think there's a chance that Japan would bomb us now because they'd be bombing the greatest number of people who are buying Hondas and Toyotas and everything else. So you tend to not bomb your best customer. So again, free trade would mean more peace.
Correct. And even the Export Control Act of 1940 from FDR freezing Japanese assets, that is also what led to what otherwise was a peaceful relationship turned it hostile. What is the libertarian position on education? I'm terrified that we might have an ignorant populace in the absence of the state providing K through 12 education with no direct cost to the consumer or the student. What's a libertarian response?
Oh, so you think their ignorance is in how much it costs to educate the students?
No, I'm saying that I am a progressive, and I feel that education is a right that I want everyone to have. Therefore, the state should supply that education. How does the libertarian respond?
Well, again, from a moral standpoint, I'm not sure how that could be a right, because the only way that's a right would be to take money away from somebody else, which is now you're taking away that person's right. So first of all, that, by the strict definition of the word, that cannot be a right. So the question is how do we get the most people educated for the lowest cost and the highest quality? And what we've seen is that the federal government, the local governments can't do it. A lot of people don't realize that if you look at the cost, including all the administration, the cost of a local student to be educated through the government schools is something like 6 times what it is to go to a private school. And often the private schools outdo the public schools. So why do you want to pay, if you say education is a right, let me ask you, why would you want to pay 6 times the money for less quality?
I know, when you could be giving the money to Keith Knight, don't tread on anyone. It's a terrible deal.
Okay.
So, what I'm trying to do is get in the mindset of the progressive. Of course, I don't advocate anything like that. I think when people say healthcare is a right, education's a right, that's something they just want everyone to have without any ability to discriminate. So I really want to try and communicate the message to them that if you want everyone to have something, you want a peaceful, voluntary, free society. Any final comments on what you'd say to someone who wants everyone to have really good education?
Well, if you want really good education, just look at the quality and the price, and there's no other choice except for what we call private education. And first of all, notice the government has changed the words. So now, we hear private education like somehow that's elite. And then we have public schools as though that's good, it's open to the public. I prefer to use government-run schools as opposed to public schools. And the other ones are just schools. But I would like to point out, when anybody hears the term right, what they need to think of is the term obligation. You can't have a term without an obligation. And if there's an obligation, it's not a right.
Of course. Excellent point.
One last thing as well, to somebody who's a progressive, would you like to have all the schools with prayer, or all the schools with whatever, maybe teaching creationism? In order for people to get with the education that they want, we need to give people the choice. Otherwise, we're all one size fits all.
Exactly. For the same reason they shouldn't be forced to fund churches and church education, we shouldn't be forced to fund government education. Say that I am someone who sees the poor elderly as a uniquely vulnerable demographic and believe this is why we absolutely, unquestioningly need Social Security. What is the libertarian response to Social Security?
Well, the libertarian response is that Social Security should have never been brought about to begin with, because once again, government does not do nearly as good of a job as a private industry does. So, but we're here now. So we've got this huge problem. We know it's a Ponzi scheme. We know it's not secure. So what do we do now? Under my plan, I would have an immediate opt-out so that younger people could stop paying into a broken system in which they know that they're not going to get their get any kind of payout. However, to the retirees who spent 50 years having that money taken from their paycheck before they even got it, who had absolutely no choice. We need to take care of them. So what I would do is I would sell off government assets and refund the money to them, basically, because we know the money did not go into a lockbox like Al Gore told us. It went into paying the government to pay for the upkeep and these buildings and so forth. So let's sell those buildings, mineral rights, whatever, and give them the profits.
What is your elevator pitch to conservatives?
Well, I don't like to give an elevator pitch. I prefer to ask somebody, do you think government is too big or too small? Or I ask them, what's the most important thing? However, I would say that in my current, with my platform, I would turn to healthcare. And I would say, you know what? You guys have the right idea that, yes, healthcare should not be single payer. However, Donald Trump has not fixed the problem. So let me show you how we can fix the problem, because Republicans already want a smaller government for healthcare. And I'd like to point out, I always make the distinction between the many fine Republican voters and the Republican politicians who keep promising smaller government and never give it. I truly believe that most Republicans do want smaller government.
Sure. So let's say that conservative says my number one value is law and order. Why should I consider libertarianism?
Law and order for, I'm sorry, for which one?
Say you're talking to a conservative and they say, what my primary focus is law and order. Why should I give your ideology a consideration?
Oh, that's a good question. Because you're right, Republicans are very law and order. I would say that right now, with the drug war, all we're doing is we are creating a bigger mess than we have. We're no longer able to put muggers and rapists in jail. We're letting people out early because they committed the so-called crime of using drugs. And most Republicans that I talk with agree that we should have never had alcohol prohibition. And I would ask them, do you want, would you like alcohol prohibition and start locking people up for alcohol? And point out that when we had alcohol prohibition, again, we're not going after the real criminals. So let's stop letting these people out. You know, you get charged with murder and you're out 6 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. How about, wouldn't you like to put a murderer away in jail for 20, 30 years? Well, we need to let these people out who did not commit a crime at all, beyond what the people in the 1920s were doing, which was having a glass of gin.
Of course, and you'd have less crime overall. You wouldn't have gangs like you had Al Capone's gang, because they had to have the black market. High risk leads to violence. You wouldn't have drug gangs either. I want to finish with your elevator pitch to progressives. So let's say you ask them, what do you care about? And they say, poverty, inequality, or police brutality. If you just have a couple minutes to give the elevator pitch for libertarianism to progressives, what do you say?
I would basically sum up what we've already been talking about and say, you know, look at the environment. Everywhere there's bigger government, there's more pollution. Would you like a clean earth or a polluted earth? What we have now is we have armed policemen acting like soldiers. Would you like police to go back to being police, or would you like this military state? If you look at Democrats, if you look at people on the left, traditionally they were for the party of peace. And the biggest thing I would emphasize is bring the troops home, that we are the anti-war party. We're the only anti-war party, that even Tulsi Gabbard, who received a lot of support for her anti-war stance, was basically booted by the party elders. They did everything they could to keep her out of debates and to keep her voice from being heard, because they knew that Democrats would just flock to her message. So instead of letting her get her message out, they had to quiet her, you know, keep her quiet so they couldn't hear. So I would say, you know what, your party did a horrible job of not letting your anti-war person speak. You can come to us. That's what we lead with.
Dr. Jorgensen, thanks so much for coming on to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone to speak with me. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you would like the average voter to hear about your candidacy or libertarianism?
Yes, two things. First of all, come to my website at joj2020.com. And also, we are just so ecstatic over the fact that the majority of the volunteers coming to my site are non-libertarians. So you don't have to be a libertarian to support my candidacy. You don't have to be a libertarian to think that government is too big and we need to make it smaller.
Dr. Jorgensen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, I appreciate it.